Now, believing that the war in Ukraine has a silver lining, that it's accelerating an energy transition to zero carbon energy sources or energy transition, whatever you may call it, that is definitely wrong-headed thinking. Don't believe that nonsense. Now, certainly when a bureaucrat or an environmentalist is exposed with the energy chaos that their policies create, and then they're further exposed when a dictator decides to monger war in places like Ukraine or in the situation of a Putin, those individuals whose actions have been exposed, they're going to become desperate. Now, what do bureaucrats and environmentalists and mainstream media and those in academia, what do they typically do when exposed or when feeling pressure? That's right, they often resort to first denial and then second, doubling down by using the crisis that they caused, ironically or brazenly, as justification to do more of the same type of prescriptions and policies and mandates that got them into the messes to begin with. A perfect and an absolutely perfect current example of this in action with respect to Europe and energy and climate policies in the Ukraine is what the EU Green Deal chief said recently. His name is Mr. Timmermans. Yes, his title is EU Green Deal chief. He said, quote, "Renewables give us the freedom to choose an energy source that is clean, cheap, reliable, and ours," end quote. So let me repeat that. Renewables give us the freedom to choose an energy source that is clean, cheap, reliable, and ours. Now look, I've seen my share of many statements from bureaucrats and environmentalists in the left that ring quite hollow and untrue when you break them down with logic and math and science. But this simple sentence from the EU Green Deal chief is perhaps the most brazen exemplar of deep mistruth that I've seen in a long, long time. So let's break this down word by word, shall we? So the problems start at the very beginning of the sentence. The first word in that sentence that I read from the EU Green Deal chief was renewables. Now, we all know by now that there is no such thing as truly renewable energy. There's no perpetual motion machine unless you're reading some science fiction book or H.G. Wells or watching The Twilight Zone. And all energy has a carbon footprint when you assess across a life cycle, scopes 1 through 3 basis. So the term renewable energy at the very start of this quagmire of a sentence should alert you that you're about to experience more mistruths, or as our political leader calls it, malarkey, as the sentence unfolds and progresses. Now, the next troubling term in that sentence is the freedom to choose an energy source, that term freedom to choose an energy source. That is a laughable phrase within the sentence because with climate and energy policies that Europe embraces these days, there is an absolute lack of freedom to choose energy sources. Decisions on which energy source and what components of the energy options will make up the portfolio of, say, the grid under today's climate and energy policies and regulations within Europe, and unfortunately increasingly within the United States, those are dictated by government and its cohorts to citizens, to businesses, to value creators, to doers, and ultimately to taxpayers. Same with what mode of transportation you take these days, and so on. Yes, draconian policies that mandate that certain favored energy forms be utilized more than others, and that disfavored forms of energy be penalized relative to others, they're all the rage, and the cause, I might say, of these problems. But then there's the reference later in this magical sentence to clean, cheap, and reliable energy that results from the so-called renewable energy and these policies that create the so-called freedom to choose. Well, the reality, of course, constant listeners, is quite different than what the EU Green Deal chief is warranting. Because as we're learning, wind and solar and electric vehicles, they are horribly damaging to the environment on both a CO2, scopes 1 through 3 basis, as well as on a surface disruption basis when you start to consider all the extractive processes and activities that need to occur to come up with the materials and compounds and elements to manufacture those wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicle batteries. Wind and solar in particular are also far from cheap. We're learning more and more across different regions and nations and economies, whether it's New England, Texas, California, or Europe, that wind and solar are very costly compared to forms of energy such as natural gas, to the point where the cost of that so-called renewable energy is damaging economies and driving them into recession. But the most outrageous part of this most outrageous of sentences from the EU Green Deal chief is the very last word of the sentence. That word is ours, as in the energy will be ours under a renewable world. Hey, there is nothing about wind, solar, or electric vehicles that is going to be ours. Instead, those forms of energy and those modes of transportation are going to be China's and Russia's. That's because the materials and the compounds and the elements that must be extracted from the earth and that must be processed and that then must be used to manufacture the components of wind turbines and solar panels and electric vehicle batteries, they necessarily must be done in those types of nations. Why? Because that's where Mother Earth placed those materials, and also because those are the nations that have strategically positioned themselves by duping the Western world to adopt these types of damaging climate policies and mandates. And then the Chinas and the Russias, they build their economies or retool in some instances their industries to manufacture these components so that they hold our energy security in their hands. The vaunted energy transition is not going to be ours. It's going to be theirs, as in our enemies. And doubling down on these climate policies and using Putin as the reason, it's only making it worse. So maybe it's time to create a new award. This is far middle history in the making, constant listeners. Mark it down. You were there, episode 79, late November 2022. It is the first time that the far middle awarded the crown of Claptrap. In 2022, the crown goes to the EU Green Deal chief, Mr. Timmermans, coming up with this sentence of renewables give us the freedom to choose an energy source that is clean, cheap, reliable, and ours. Perhaps the most concentrated amalgamation of Claptrap ever constructed in the annals of bureaucratic speak. Well done, Mr. Timmermans. Well done.